Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Things I Can't Explain. My name is Casey and I am so excited you guys are here. If you are watching this video right here on YouTube and you do enjoy my content, I would super appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. I will also be linking my social media in the description box so you can follow me on TikTok and Instagram. This episode is also available in podcast format, so you can listen to it on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. Now, tonight's episode is a story that has genuinely terrified me for as long as I can remember, and that is the true story of the Amityville Horror. Now, I do think when most people hear Amityville, they immediately think of the movies and maybe even the books, but what people don't realize is that this story has lost so many details along the way of what actually happened to not only the Lutz family, but also the DeFeos. So, before we get into tonight's episode, I do want to just quickly make a small disclaimer. I will be discussing some darker themes in this episode, so viewer discretion is advised. So, before the haunting part of this story that is so well known today even begins, what people don't realize is that the house already had an extremely dark history, and in my opinion, is more terrifying than anything that was to come. In 1974, a year before the Lutz family moved in, 6 people from the same family were tragically murdered in what is now known as the Amityville house. Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his parents and his siblings in that house in their beds while they were sleeping. Now, I feel like it is extremely important to discuss what happened with the DeFeos before getting into the rest of the story, because to me, that is essentially the reason why everything else happened the way that it happened later on. Now, the DeFeo family consisted of the parents, who were Ronald DeFeo Sr., who was 43 at the time, and Louise DeFeo, who was 42, and then their 5 children. They had Dawn, who was 18, Allison, who was 13, Mark, who was 12, and John Matthew, who was 9. And then, of course, there was Ronald DeFeo Jr., who, at only 23 years old, was later found guilty of murdering his family. In the years leading up to the murders, Ronald Jr. was described as someone who had severe anger issues. He was also struggling with drug and alcohol abuse, and there are reports that the police were called to their house several times for domestic disturbances involving Ronald Jr. It's also said that he had an extremely violent relationship with his father, Ronald Sr. Now, friends later described Ronald Jr. as someone who seemed to be becoming more unstable and paranoid and sort of disconnected from reality. And there are also claims that Ronald believed that his parents were plotting against him. Now, on November 13th, 1974, Ronald Jr. retrieved a .35 caliber rifle and sadly shot and killed every member of his family while they were sleeping. This event took place sometime in the early morning hours between 3 to 3:30 a.m., but here is where the details become extremely confusing and, in my opinion, incredibly terrifying. Every victim was found lying face down in their bed, and there were no signs of any of them trying to escape or any sort of struggle. And the reason this is confusing is because, obviously, if he had gone into his parents' room first and there was some sort of commotion, I would assume screaming and shouting, and then obviously the sounds of the gunshots, you would assume that one of the children, if not all of them, would have heard this and, of course, tried to run out of their room to see what had happened or maybe hide somewhere. So it's extremely odd that they were all in the same position in their bedrooms and there was no disturbance anywhere else in the house. This is where theories come in that Ronald Jr. had possibly drugged the members of his family earlier that night because he was planning on carrying out these murders and assumed maybe that would make it a little easier. Now, another alarming detail surrounding this case is that there were absolutely no witnesses. There is not one single neighbor that heard any commotion coming from the house that night, and no one heard any screaming or gunshots. To this day, no one is really able to explain how 6 people were murdered in that house with pretty much no reaction. Now, later that same morning, Ronald Jr. was said to have run into a local bar screaming and shouting that his parents had been murdered. But of course, police followed him to his home and sadly discovered the bodies. At first, Ronald Jr. claimed that a mob hitman had carried out these murders, but that story pretty quickly collapsed once he was under interrogation, and he did confess to murdering his family. He was later convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. Now, over the years, Ronald Jr.'s story changed several times. He claimed at one point that there were accomplices that helped him carry out these murders, and he also claimed that he was hearing voices in the house telling him to do what he did. Several times he would retract these claims and then reinstate them, but none of these claims were ever substantiated. So when George and Kathy Lutz decided to purchase this home a year later, they were very aware of what had happened in that house, but they assumed that it was in the past and that Ronald Jr. was in jail, and to them, this was their dream home, so they figured they would be able to handle it. Now, George and Kathy Lutz were pretty much just starting out their lives together as a newlywed couple. They had just previously gotten married in July of 1975 before purchasing their home in December. Previously, they were living in Deer Park, New York, with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. But after Kathy and George got married, George felt like he was really stepping into the role of stepfather, and they kind of wanted to find their forever home. Now, like I said, Kathy did have 3 children from her previous marriage, and they were Daniel, who was 9, Christopher, who was 7, and Melissa, who went by Missy, who was 5 years old. For the Lutzes, this move felt like a new beginning for their little blended family, but the second that they moved in, things immediately began to feel off. The first thing that happened was George began waking up every single night around 3:15 a.m. And oddly, this was about the same time frame that the DeFeo murders had taken place. Now, when George described these sleep disturbances, he didn't really feel as though he was having nightmares that he was waking up from. He never saw anything when he woke up, but he was feeling extreme and severe anxiety. He felt incredibly tense, and the second that he woke up, he felt like he was on edge, but he was also extremely alert. And he said that it felt like his body had learned how to wake up and do this on its own, and that he really didn't have any control over it. He said he felt like something was pulling him out of his sleep, and at times he would feel compelled to sort of walk around the house. For some reason, he felt like he needed to check the windows, the doors, the locks, and for some reason, the furnace. Now, I never found any information as to why he did these things specifically, but I would assume if he was feeling anxious and waking up every night, that maybe he thought that something was wrong in his house and he wanted to make sure everything was safe and secure. He also said that these nights where he would walk around his house, he would feel certain spots in the house that were absolutely freezing, even with the heat turned on, but they were always in the same locations, which was the upstairs hallway, near the staircase, and then, of course, the basement. Now, around the same time that these sleep disturbances were occurring for George, he also was having inexplicable and extreme changes in his mood. When he described it himself, he said that it wasn't something that happened suddenly, but he could feel himself inside slowly starting to change. George constantly felt extremely irritable and filled with rage. He said he had anger for really no reason at all, but mostly he would feel this anytime that he was in or near the basement. Now, while George was going through all of this, this is when inexplicable and odd odors began to show up in their home. George and Kathy both reported multiple different odors that would seem to appear out of nowhere and then disappear just as quickly. The smells varied, but most commonly reported were a sweet, sort of perfume like smell, an odor that smelled like sewage, and then at times they also smelled sulfur. These odors were sort of contained to certain areas in the home. Sometimes they would be in the bedrooms upstairs, but they were also in the same areas where George was feeling the cold spots. Now, there are reports that the children also noticed these odors and even guests visiting the home, especially the sewage smell. Now, eventually, George and Kathy did hire someone to come out and check out their home just to make sure that there wasn't something wrong with the pipes. There were no dead animals found anywhere. There really was no logical explanation for these odors, but especially the sewage smell. Now, the next thing that George and Kathy were experiencing while all of this was going on is Kathy said that she would feel suddenly and inexplicably sad. She would have an overwhelming urge to cry, and she couldn't really make sense of it because she would go from room to room, and in one room she would feel completely fine, but once she was in certain rooms, she would just have a deep wave of sadness and say that she felt a lot of emotional pressure. After all of these events were occurring, George and Kathy also reported swarms of flies in their home. Now, the flies were seemingly coming out of nowhere, and they would sort of concentrate all together in specific areas of the house, even in the winter time. And again, they did have people come and check the home. There was no logical explanation as to where these flies were coming from, but they would also disappear just as quickly as they had shown up. Now, as I said, George was starting to have extreme anger issues, and as this was kind of escalating, he described that the feeling that he had was sort of a building feeling. He said he became obsessed with the house, especially the basement, but he also described it as feeling repulsed by the basement as much as he was obsessed with it. And eventually, he would spend all of his time down there. He would find any excuse he could to be in the basement, especially at night. And whenever Kathy or the children mentioned anything about this to him, he would become violently angry and defensive. At this point, Kathy obviously was sort of beside herself with everything that was happening in the home, and she would suggest to George that maybe it was time for them to move. And the second that she would bring this up in conversation, George was adamant that they stayed, and it made him incredibly angry. But at this point, this is when the children got more involved, and they started to tell George and Kathy that they were hearing voices. They would hear voices throughout the house. They would hear voices call their names specifically, and there was never anyone there. They heard a lot of movement and noises at night. And then Missy claimed to have an imaginary friend. Originally, she described the friend as a person, but later on, she told George and Kathy that it was a pig-like creature with glowing eyes. At some point throughout these experiences, George and Kathy decided to call a priest out to their home to bless their house. They called Father Mancuso. One day, Father Mancuso came into the home to bless the house. He did say he felt extreme coldness in the room hit him out of nowhere, and then something that felt like he was being slapped across the face. He also said that he very clearly heard a voice tell him to get out, and that is when he left. He felt like he was in danger and he could not finish blessing the house. And then later that day, after he left, he began to develop marks on his hands that looked like blisters. As hard as it is to believe, the Lutz family only stayed in that house for 28 days. It's crazy to imagine how so much happened in such a short amount of time, and there was no sort of dramatic finale or big ending. They had just reached a point where they could no longer take living in that home with everything going on, and they didn't have anywhere else to go, but they packed up as much of their belongings as they could and they left. Once the Lutz family left, their story went public. When this happened, this was the point that Ed and Lorraine Warren heard about this home and wanted to go and conduct their own investigation. Ed and Lorraine visited the home only once in March of 1978. At this point, the Lutz family had been gone for about 2 months, but they conducted one overnight investigation where they brought a small team of investigators with them, a few photographers, and then also the priest that had previously come to bless the home. Lorraine Warren said that she immediately felt an inhumane spirit the second that she entered the home that was filled with violence and rage and oppression. Lorraine also claimed that she could see visions of the past tied to the home, specifically Ronald DeFeo Jr. and when he had murdered his family. Now, while the team was there during this investigation, a lot of them said they experienced nausea, dizziness, and an overwhelming sense of panic. And they also all felt extremely uncomfortable near the staircase and the basement. Now, during this time, one of the photographers that was there took what is now an infamous but terrifying photo where a small child with glowing eyes appears in the picture, peering from around the staircase. The Warrens believed that this could be the spirit of John Matthew, but skeptics, of course, say that this was just a person that was in the house at the time or that the photo was altered. But I have seen this photo circulating online for many years, and something about it just makes me feel so uneasy when I see it. It very well could be nothing, but to me, it just gives me a very creepy feeling and like a feeling of dread. At this point, Lorraine felt like the activity in the home was escalating too quickly and they decided to cut the investigation short and leave. Now, this is when the story of Amityville really picked up and movies started to be released, and then, of course, books. And with every version, things got louder and scarier. People started pointing out inconsistencies. Some investigators later said that things were exaggerated, and others straight up called it a hoax. But of course, not everyone agrees. Some people think that what happened was psychological, that the combination of the murders and the stress and the financial pressure sort of created this fear that spiraled out of control. Others think that there is trauma attached to that house in a way that we fully don't understand. But it is said that when George and Kathy did leave that home, George's mood changed immediately and everything went back to normal with the family. He no longer had sleep disturbances, and the family didn't feel like they were having any other sort of experiences wherever they were. Later on, the house was completely renovated. It gained a private address and it became a normal residence. There have been multiple families that have lived in that home since then, and no one has ever made any claims of anything paranormal or out of the ordinary happening in that house. But it does always make me wonder, was there something originally going on in that house that did kind of push Ronald Jr. into some sort of psychosis? Was he kind of being controlled or possessed by something that told him to murder his family? Or was it simply someone struggling with mental health issues? But then I also think after the murders took place, were the spirits of that family attached to that home? Or was there something dark attached to that home because of the horrific things that had occurred? And is that what caused there to be some sort of haunting or entities in that home that the Lutz family experienced? I would love to know what you guys think in the comments below. Also, if somehow you have any experiences with the Amityville home, I know many people have gone and visited, and some people claim that they have seen or heard things while they were there. I would love to know your thoughts. Also, if you follow me on Instagram, you can DM me directly if you have any unexplainable stories or experiences of your own. I would love to read them and hopefully be able to share them in future podcast episodes. But for now, that is it for this episode. I appreciate you guys so much, and I will see you next time.